We are live with the great Jim Valliant today. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, because Mark is busy getting his hair and makeup done. Neither Jim nor I are into that sort of stuff. So we are here and we are ready to rock and roll. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to this program. And also remember to check out my podcast, The Rational Egoist. We've got a great episode out right now with Donald Boudreaux, the economist. And hopefully tomorrow I'll have an interview up that I just did with a psychologist. So things are looking up, things are looking good, but we've got to dive in here. We've got some stuff to talk about. So let me just let's see what I want to start with, Jim. What do you think? Any preference?
Well, no.
Oh, I know what I want to start with. I know. I want to start with the death penalty stuff.
This giant list, of course, that you send usually to Mark. You sent to me, of course, this morning. But I meant I show up on time.
You and Mark are it's like, oh my God. For God's sakes, you are a college graduate. You went to college. You've done murder cases. The list that I'm sending is not this overwhelming list.
Oh, you will find that unlike Mark, I have done my homework. I've read the articles that you actually sent me.
Okay, so since you took the shot at Mark, I'm okay. So just so you guys know, the reason that we didn't run the Twilight Zone opening is because it seems that perhaps we've run afoul of copyright law. So we just have to get permission, pay for the licensing, whatever, and we're going to take care of that. We're big believers in intellectual property here, so we don't want to, not abide by that. So, Jim, the Donald wants to implement the death penalty for all murder cases in Washington, D.C. Now, technically, the federal government it's a federal city. They can do this sort of thing. I think it should be done by Congress and not by the president. But nevertheless, the federal government does have authority. However, the vast majority of the people in Washington are Democrats, and Democrats overwhelmingly oppose the death penalty. So it doesn't seem that the people that actually live there want it. I'll get into some of my own thoughts on the death penalty in a little bit and maybe piss off half the audience. But for now, what do you think about this?
Well, I think Washington, D.C. is an exception, and it's an exception with his use of the National Guard there, too. While there has been, look, what was it, 50 years ago now, or more, but it was about 50 years ago, I believe, 55 years ago, something like that, in the early 1970s, where the District of Columbia was granted a degree of self-rule. Now, on the other hand, under the Constitution, they are legislated by Congress, and Congress could at any time limit, take away that local rule. And by the way, the president is still the chief executive, even over the mayor of D.C. So D.C. presents unique problems and perhaps even constitutional problems that haven't been fully worked out. Now, I myself think that D.C. has grown too much. Maryland and Virginia took back a good chunk of its bit of DC, and I think that the other side of it, Maryland should take back the other big chunk. If these people are disenfranchised, which they are meant to be, and that was the whole point of the DC as a special enclave in the Constitution, they don't have the same rights as people who live in states. Get over it. And if you don't like that, if you think that's disenfranchising, well, then you all can go back, at least the chunk of it that came from Maryland can go back to Maryland jurisdiction, and DC can go back to the small little area that it probably should be. But the truth is that federal policy does trump local policy, and can, and theoretically maybe in many other ways too, unless we get a Supreme Court ruling about some of this. Again, so much of what Trump does is like headed to the Supreme Court for adjudication. But death penalty or the use of the National Guard in DC is a separate matter than it would be, say, in Chicago. Chicago does have a terrible murder rate. I mean, we talk about declining crime statistics all we want, but once he steps out of that, he can't, for example, demand that New York execute people under New York law, or Illinois and execute people despite what Illinois law says about the death penalty. And that's that. So if he extends this beyond DC, he'll have constitutional problems, it seems to me. But he's also, in effect, undermining the spirit of the self-rule bit in DC. I can understand that. But when it comes to basic law and law enforcement, it's still a federal enclave. And there, Trump may have solid arguments about how the federal government, when it doesn't like what the locals are doing, can come in and do it his way. Now, it's true that the death penalty is popular among Americans generally, but not in democratically controlled cities like DC. And so you observe a very obvious fact. The majority of the residents of the district oppose the death penalty. And here comes along Donald Trump to say, no, y'all got to have the death penalty. He is technically and perhaps constitutionally the chief executive of the District of Columbia, and there's nothing anybody can do about that.
Jim, just as a fun aside, do you know how DC became the capital?
Washington himself, I think, donated the land.
I mean, the decision to make it happen.
To make it happen.
Yeah.
No, you probably can give me a history lesson on this. Maybe
So,
New York and Philadelphia. There were capitals before DC.
Yeah, it was in New York, and then it switched to Philadelphia for 10 years and then off to DC. It was the result of a dinner meeting.
A dinner meeting.
I want to say it was Hamilton, Jefferson, and I'm not sure who else was there. So Hamilton at the time wanted to pay off the federal, I mean, the debts. He wanted, what was it called? Assumption, I think, of the debts. Basically level them out. Just say, look, none of the colonies that were now states owe any money. Jefferson and company didn't want it. So they made a compromise where Hamilton would get his way, but Jefferson and company would get Washington as the capital, as the permanent capital. I may have some of the technicalities wrong, but that's the gist of it. I think it's a very interesting story. In the book I read on it, they called a dinner party that changed everything. Or,
the dinner party that gave us DC.
Yeah. The thing is with the death penalty, first of all, for all the people, because I always hear people, they tell me, they're for the death penalty. And I always wonder, for people who are very pro death penalty, is if they had to administer it, would they still be as in favor of it? That's one thing. I don't think there's constitutional issues with the death penalty, and I certainly understand the justice aspect of giving people what they deserve. Two things, though, or maybe even three. I am not comfortable with giving the government that kind of power, especially because it's permanent. If you get a guy and you convict him of something and it's, and he gets found innocent 20 years later, he can't get to 20 years back, but he's still living. You execute somebody by mistake, there's no coming back from that. So just the power issue.
No way to come.
No, given the government issue, and then this idea that it's going to be for every murder, there's a vast difference, between murders. Like that's not even the case now. I mean, in death penalties.
Going by your constitutional reasoning, my brother, under the 8th Amendment, they might be able to hang horse thieves.
Oh, I think they could. Whether they should is a different question.
I disagree with, of course, your approach to the Bill of Rights, and so I would be, a loosey-goosey living constitution guy compared to you, because I actually think that the Supreme Court should look at it conceptually and on principle, not be restricted to the practices.
This was actually going to be my next question. So would you make the argument that the 8th Amendment outlaws the death penalty or precludes death penalty?
I think that the 8th Amendment invites precisely what the Supreme Court has done. They've said, well, what does this really mean? It means that, when they say no excessive bail and no cruel and unusual punishments, they get to decide what those concepts mean. And those concepts can mean, for example, in objective, rational terms, proportionate punishment. That is to say, hanging horse thieves would be disproportionate because the harm that you've caused is so disproportionate to the punishment you're meting out. Now, the Supreme Court, I think, in my view, probably went too far when, again, 55 years ago, or nearly just thereabouts, I'm guesstimating these times, overturned the death penalty as such as being unconstitutional. I think they had poor historical arguments, but also it didn't really fit the rational principle that they were developing. It has to be proportionate to the crime, proportionate punishment, which I think is an objective way of looking at that aspect of the Eighth Amendment. They quickly reversed themselves, but in the decades since, they've put on all kinds. It's not just any murder. The Supreme Court has said you can't do it with juveniles, you can't do it with people with mental disability. You can't. Yeah, there have to be special aggravants. There has to be a certain level of proof. For example, in California, we have for most criminal cases beyond a reasonable doubt. And then when we ask the jury, should there be a death penalty, we say, is there any shadow of a doubt? That is to say, is there any remote doubt? So the Supreme Court is sort of amped up. So it has to be an aggravated murder. It can't be, you can't use the death penalty on children or the mentally disabled. And the nature of the execution has to be humane. And so on all of these issues, the Supreme Court has, even when it brought back the death penalty after its little temporary sojourn against the death penalty, has imposed upon the death penalty. And I think that is exactly the role of the United States Supreme Court.
Didn't they rule, Jim, when they found it unconstitutional, that it was being applied disproportionately?
That was part of it. And that's the kind of empirical thing that they may not, that I think is beyond them. If that was their concern, they could have addressed it in a far different way. It seems to me.
Now, Race Jacobson says that Trump's argument that the death penalty is a powerful deterrent to murder just doesn't match up to the reality. And I agree. The statistics don't match it up. And the fact of the matter is, somebody that's on the verge of killing somebody does not engage in that kind of calculus.
No.
They do not say, okay, look, I was gonna get killed, but since now I'm only gonna spend 60 years in prison, I'm gonna commit the murder, right?
No, they don't.
Yeah.
Kind of well,
As somebody who's committed many crimes, I could tell you that was never a factor in my thinking what statutes were saying.
Exactly. Are we really out there thinking that when people commit most murders, they're weighing I could get life without parole, but no, it's the death penalty that really prevents me.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. Yeah. A big deterrent is the fear of getting caught. So if you actually see police, that's what the evidence shows. So for instance, Trump's policies, as abhorrent as I find them to be, of putting the National Guard in DC, that makes sense. If all your goal is to stop people from committing crimes, then that would make some sense.
Dramatic reduction.
Sure. But at what cost? And that's where my problem with that comes in.
Well, that's the thing. To me, the look is bad to have armed military personnel doing law enforcement. And in our country's history, there's been a huge pushback on that. In fact, Congress has passed laws against doing that, using the U.S. military inside the United States. Now, is this an insurrection? Is this an invasion? Because the Constitution, it seems to me, at least indicates that that's the kind of thing that it would have to be for the president to invoke the National Guard and get uniformed troops out there. And I don't see, he can declare an emergency, and of course everything is an emergency for Trump, but an emergency, there's been in recent years, a secular decline in the crime rate. Now, they say that the crime statistics may be underreported, but crime statistics are always underreported, and I want to know what that real difference is. That doesn't end the inquiry. But the truth is, I do see, independent of Trump and everything else, sure, we had the blip for COVID in crime, but it now is recovering from that. There was during the 21st century, there's sort of been a secular decline in the crime rate. But when you're a victim of a crime, you don't much care about crime statistics, do you?
No. But there is a reason. People, sometimes say, well, the statistics are all over the place. Well, there's different measures, right? I mean, there's arrests, there's convictions, there's, calls to the police, sort of self, then there's the self-reports of victims. Maybe they didn't call the police. So it makes sense.
Studies. The government doesn't do these, but private organizations will do. Hey, we know you didn't report this to the cops, and we will keep your answer confidential. Were you a victim? So certain crimes are notoriously underreported, rape and child molest in particular. Most murders get reported. Most rapes and child molests do not get reported. Now, those are the discrepancies in reporting that are significant. But also, if you're not charging people with felonies when they're doing felonies, that will affect one of the measures by which the Justice Department measures the crime.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, with all the victimless crimes, I mean, you don't, people that are out there doing drugs aren't reporting it as a crime, right? They're
No.
not like, yes, I was getting high on Tuesday.
Oh
Please
no.
factor
Oh
this
no.
into your
And
statistics.
if you're on the streets doing drugs or buying drugs, you're in a far different situation than, say, the middle class drug problem, which goes
Yeah,
completely unnoticed in effect. And so the people living in nice neighborhoods they get away with their long-term drug addictions. And so rich people all the time, you'll hear about these long-term, they'll have to go to the Betty Ford Center. Well, how did they get away with it? Well, they weren't buying or using their drugs on the streets. And this results in a very disproportionate enforcement of drug laws. One of the areas where we still see significant racially disproportionate crime enforcement is, I think, a direct result of the war on drugs.
sure. So, okay, so you're not a supporter of the death penalty, I don't think, and neither am I. Mark, I believe, is. So Mark is wrong on this issue.
Well,
And Jim is on the right side of this
well,
issue.
my well, I'll push back a little bit here. I absolutely believe that under the proportionality rule that the Supremes have given us for Eighth Amendment interpretation, I don't have an argument against the death penalty. It's on the evidence side. It's on the epistemology side that I myself have qualms about it. You make a point about should we let government do this at all business? For example, would we allow them to put people on the rack or use fire, burning fire, iron. We wouldn't allow them to torture people. And, but in some cases, what if they've got a sadistic torture killer? Would that be it might be theoretically proportionate
Sure.
to torture a torturer, but on the other hand, I would not want the government to be able to ever do that. You can't be precise and proportionate in that way. And in fact, in some ways, the death penalty is an easier out than the murder, than the fear and the terror and the surprise and the innocence of the victim
Oh,
versus.
yeah.
So, but on the other hand, you're right. I think there has to be let me put it this way. There are cases, very few, where it is super obvious that the person committed the crime, in which I would be those are obviously the hard cases for me, even if I am skeptical of the death penalty. Because look, he confessed. We have it on three different angles on video, him committing the crime. Take the case of this Luigi guy who killed the healthcare executive. In my view, just reviewing the evidence, there's no doubt in my mind this guy's guilty as hell. And so the point is, and it was a very premeditated murder. And he really doesn't have a psychological defense from what I can see. I can see all those things from a mile off as a former prosecutor. The question is, would it be the correct thing to do to execute Luigi? Well, it was one murder. I'm not sure it reaches the state of aggravation that the Supreme Court requires for aggravated murders to hit the death penalty. Now, the Supreme Court law to one side, my own view, this death penalty would be fair and just if we could be absolutely certain that we haven't made even the slightest mistake. And that is a level of certainty I don't think a courtroom can provide. Now, if you ask me about the hundreds of criminal trials I did, I will tell you right now, I am absolutely confident that every single defendant that I convicted was guilty of the crime that I convicted him of. I'm not sure every prosecutor in the country can say that with the same confidence I have. Courts of appeals have all tended to agree with me, so I have a increased confidence. On the other, and I think we can prove things beyond a reasonable doubt with reasonable certainty, but even reasonable certainty can, on the rare occasion, get a surprise. And the principle of I'd rather let a bunch of guilty people go free than ever convict an innocent guy. I think that principle, when it comes to the death penalty, is extremely important. I would rather let 10 guys who deserve the death penalty live with life, without parole, rather than execute a single person. Now, since the death penalty has been brought back by the Supreme Court, the opponents to the death penalty have yet to find a person who's been executed. And they've been all, the Innocence Project that uses DNA, they've got off the hook all kinds of murderers and other criminals, rapists and other criminals, and even murderers, by the way. But they haven't overturned a death penalty in the sense of this guy was really innocent and he was executed in the last 50 years. They haven't, not one yet, Michael.
anybody that wants to see a great argument for the death penalty, it's the strongest that I've seen yet. It's in a book called The Death of Punishment by Robert Blecker. And he really makes he's what is known as a retributivist. He thinks that punishment for punishment's sake is a good thing, and he does make a very good argument. And what he does is he really focuses on the worst of the worst, really just savage murderers. And but I can't get around it in my head, the idea that I do not want a government that's supposed to be representing the freest people on earth executing people. I can't do it.
But if you were to ask me in the abstract, what does this guy justly deserve? If I know with certainty that he did this horrible serial killing, I would tell you he deserves death.
I don't even disagree with you. I don't.
Speaking,
yeah, sure. I don't disagree.
But the question is, should the criminal law, should the government?
That's where the problem comes in. Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
And there's an epistemological question that, because of the permanent consequences of killing someone, I think rational, but it's also something I think that rational minds can disagree about.
Sure.
I mean, what if there was a quantum of proof that was so high and they met it beyond any kind of shadow or possible, even speculative doubt? You can almost reach that point with many cases. And so I think it is a point on which reasonable minds can disagree.
I'm not going to say that Mark has a reasonable mind on this subject. I just think he's very wrong. It's it's all emotion. So no, we're not going to give him that. I know you're dying to help him because that's what Mark, you do.
You can have a reasonable mind and disagree with this guy over here.
So that story came from Cato, and there was another story that came from Cato about pessimism. And I think I fall into this trap sometimes as well. When I think about that America is not a capitalist country because it's a mixed economy. But what the author points out is that by and large, we're still capitalists, right? That most businesses aren't being subsidized by the government, that sort of thing. You could still start businesses. You still can, pursue the profit motive, that sort of thing. But he talks about how this pessimism fuels the sort of populism that we had in the 90s with Ross Perot and that we have now with Trump. And it dovetails well with the economist Don Boudreaux. I interviewed him the other day, and he said that one of the biggest myths in economics is that we are being hollowed out. Basically the middle class is going away. And he says it's just not true. It's just BS. And I know, like you mentioned something earlier, Jim, in relation to crime. You said when you're the victim of a crime, you don't care about the statistics. And I think that's true. And I think it's fair. But I think it's also fair to say that we ought not to make criminal justice policy based on the perceptions of a crime victim. Because just because a person thinks that crime is out of control doesn't necessarily mean it is. And it's similar with a person that, say, loses his or her job and then concludes, well, the economy is in tatters. You don't base your policies on that person. And I do think there's room for optimism. I do, even though I do fall into the pessimistic trap. What do you think about this?
Well, I think there's always room for optimism so long as we can have conversations like this. And so long as in the United States we can still, protecting intellectual property so we don't violate the Twilight Zone's copyright or something. Okay, within those limits, those are perfectly reasonable limits, it seems to me. But it doesn't prevent the Twilight Zone copyright holder from giving you permission to use it either. So I'd explore that. But you're absolutely right, though. There's reason for optimism. America still has such profound freedoms in multiple ways. The high-tech industry during my lifetime has exploded, and it has created vast productivity increases in our economy. I remember my dad, who's a computer engineer back in the 1970s, telling me, Jimmy, there was a little boy, Jimmy, one day all office workstations will have computers. One day, every home will have a computer in it. And I thought to him, my God, this Star Trek sci-fi craziness. But I then witnessed before my eyes my father's prediction back in the 1970s come true. By the 1990s, computer monitors were now on nearly every office desk in the country. Computers were invading the way, when I went to law school, even in the late 80s, they were starting to teach us how to do research on computers and stuff like that, vastly increasing the productivity of our economy. Because the high-tech industry, unlike existing industries where they come in with huge regulations, labor regulations for heavy industry, all kinds of environmental and occupational safety regulations and so forth. The high-tech industry was a relatively Wild West free market. And precisely because it was a relatively free enclave in our economy, we had these huge advances, which caused huge advances in productivity. Government regulation and spending has gotten so out of hand during the same period. If it were not for the vast increases in wealth produced by the high-tech industry's increases in productivity, I don't think America would have survived all of that the socialist part of the mixed economy that has hit the U.S. economy since the 1960s. But during that same period, a relatively free area of the economy made huge advances, and that increased the productivity of our economy. Today, look at how AI is dramatically increasing productivity. That's the source of wealth and increased wealth. So long as you can have a story like the high-tech industry that has dramatically increased the productivity of work in America and still increases the wealth, right? There's still cause for optimism. But I've seen more fundamentally, so long as we have freedom of speech, we still have a chance. We still have a means of changing the world. But when those things happen, that is to say, when every industry, when no corner of the industry can go without heavy government regulation and control, or when speech itself is regulated, that's when I'll start getting really pessimistic.
We also had this article about why authoritarians don't like economics, right? Yeah. Now, I know a lot of my objectivist friends.
Right.
Yes, a lot of my objectivist friends, they don't want to hear about economics because they say this is about morality, that it's about individual rights. And I agree. The problem I have with the argument is this. I don't agree that economics is irrelevant, right? Because let's say Keynes was right, hypothetically. John Maynard Keynes is right, that without government priming the pump, the economy is going to overproduce and ultimately collapse, right? If that's the case, then it's in my interest to have the government regulate the economy. So even if I had an egoistic ethic, if Keynes is right, then I would support Keynes. The reason I support capitalism is because it's correct, because it allows me to pursue my interest and succeed at it. It doesn't have what Keynes thought was all these, tripwires in it that screw you up. Now, the author of the article talks about, and I think he's dead on, and I think he's probably channeling Mises, is he talks about how the market's all about prices, and prices reflect what people want, what people are doing and what they want. And once the government steps in with its big clumsy fist and starts knocking things over, it distorts these prices, and then business owners and entrepreneurs and capitalists have no way to know what people are doing. Have you experienced both ends of this, Jim? I want to know about your experience with totalitarians who hate economics, but I also want you to talk about your experience with some objectivists who don't like to make economic arguments.
Well, it's strange when it comes from objectivists, from my perspective, because what they're doing is they're sort of insisting on a theory-practice dichotomy. Objectivism rejects the theory-practice dichotomy in all its forms. That is to say, the moral case is intimately connected with the economic case. Intimately. Now, there are deeper reasons why people like Lord Keynes and socialists and modern monetary economics, why all of that is false. There are deeper conceptual reasons that were identified by people like Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises. If you don't get the concept in principle, why it must always fail, for example, which Mises and Rand were very keen on pointing out. No, this sort of thing, you pull out a gun and you force people, it will always create distortions, full stop. Mises with his economic arguments, Rand with her even more profound moral arguments. But, Ayn Rand, to do the little jujitsu on this, she would say, look, if socialists really cared about the poor, they'd embrace the free market. because anyone who knows history, anyone who knows economics can tell you that the only system that has ever done a damn thing for the poor has been capitalism. To the extent that there has been capitalism, the people are better off. That is a crucial part of her argument. Now she'll explain why. It liberates reason. She has the fundamental theoretical answer, but it was a theoretical answer that was inductively derived through observation of history and economics. She was a bit of a student of economics. She knew Henry Hazlitt and Ludwig von Mises. She had economics books on her shelf. She also had business histories. She also had history books, just plain old-fashioned history books on her shelf. And so it was history and economics that informed her moral argument, which was derived inductively. If there's any contradiction going either way, we got a problem. You know, we had our talk on the rational egoist about logic. It has to work both ways. That is to say, the facts have to support the theory. You'd never get to the theory. Once you get to the theory, then you can look back. But when you look back, when you say, I have this moral argument, it's not a religious argument. It doesn't come from some commandment, from Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand has inductively developed that from observing history and economics. And so the two work hand in hand. Anyone who tells you, well, there's economics over here and morality over here, they're already giving you a non-objectivist approach to the question. Right there. It's a theory practice dichotomy built into it. If the free market didn't work, it would refute Ayn Rand's idea that reason is liberated, and that's why any use of force against the rational mind will fail. Now, I think she conceptually, fundamentally understood that. And we can use that principle now. All other things being equal, sight unseen, I can now use that principle in any new case. Agreed. But where did she get that principle? Through inductively looking at history and economics.
Well, now, what about the totalitarians? To me, it's simple, right? The reason they hate economics is because it doesn't allow them to get away with their schemes.
Right. Well, yeah. And this is true on both left and right. They look, socialism, as our friend Keith Weiner has pointed out many times, is magical thinking. Anytime someone offers a socialist solution, they will always ignore some key economic principle or ignore some historical reality, or you look at it as an objectivist, ignore an important moral point. But my objectivist friends, where does that moral point come from? Yeah, it's magical thinking. Socialist solutions are always magical thinking. And so Kamala Harris, like the article points out, Kamala Harris proposes price controls. Paul Krugman, the economics editor of the New York Times, Nobel Prize winner, says, oh, that's a dumb idea. But he deletes the post himself. He suppresses what any economist, even a hard lefty economist like Krugman would do. Well, no, price economists have shown that price controls lead to shortages and disruptions and maybe the product disappearing altogether. Then no. So he puts the politics ahead. See, now they have a moral theory practice dichotomy. Their moral commitment to socialism outweighs practical considerations. You can point out to them, look, you're really not even going to help the poor. You're going to dry up low-income housing if you put these rent controls in. It's not going to help the poor. You're not going to do nothing for the poor, and you're going to hurt everybody else in the process. No. There, it's a religious. Socialists are religious in their thinking. They have magical economic thinking, and they're the ones who use moral arguments to trump any practical argument that you might have. We objectivists have theory and practice on our side, and we should integrate the two as best we can. The refutation is it's anti-life. Why is it anti-life? Well, look at what it does, in effect. And I can abstract away from the principle and say, look, reason is our tool of survival. You've got to let reason be free. Freedom is the social condition for the operation of reason. This is why socialism always fails. Well, that's true. But it's true based on the empirical facts that we've gathered up since the Industrial Revolution 200 or 300 years ago. So we don't separate. We as objectivists can and should never separate the issues of morality and economics and history. That is just simply a theory, practice, mind-body dichotomy. And it's the same dichotomy used by socialist economists or now these Trump economists. They will ignore they don't look at the seen and the unseen. They don't look at the total effect. You can point out all day long, look, there's all kinds of other reasons why maybe industries are underutilized. You're not addressing that. What you're trying to do is tax Americans to subsidize this this less competitive business, and that's all you end up doing. No, 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 no. That logic never sinks in Trump's head. Trump is willfully ignorant of matters scientific in general, but matters economic in particular, just like the same old socialist magical thinking of yore.
Yeah, let me just tell you, I'm freaking exhausted. I should be given a medal for how much effort I'm putting in to keep my eyes open, because I just want to go to sleep, right? But I can't, because I got to do this, then I got to take a ride, I got to come back, I got reports to do, I got to frame Gilder, don't forget. Speaking of the Donald, once again, there was a good article from Reason Magazine. And the one thing they pointed out that I thought was interesting was the guy says, look, I'm not saying that he's senile or that he's going crazy, but what I am saying is, how would we know the difference given the way he went in on this tangent about magnets, right? How the Chinese basically have made everybody want magnets. And then he says, but if I want to do away with magnets, I pour water on them and boom, no more magnets. I mean, this guy is unhinged, right?
He was asleep in his high school science class. No, but I will hear people say things like that, and the article pointed that out. You'll hear your crazy uncle say stuff like that, and you don't necessarily think that he's psychotic. You don't necessarily. You think, well, okay, he's poorly informed. He doesn't know. Maybe he's a little. He's emotionally biased. He has some kind of confirmation bias about some principle, some policy that he wants. But we're talking about the president of the United States here. You'd think that his advisors would be able to tell him a little something about electromagnetism. But it relates to what I was saying before. Trump will, the things that will emit from Trump's mouth are sometimes so absurd that you can't, in one sense, it sounds like he's sincere. He may really believe it in some way, but it's like factually just obviously not true, but it still comes out of his mouth. And on how many issues, on what a range of issues we have, where Trump will let the most absurd or silly things come out of his mouth, because the guy, and even more disturbing, it's more disturbing than his science understanding, more disturbing than his economics misunderstanding, is his lack of understanding of the U.S. Constitution. For God's sakes, if I elect a president, maybe he doesn't need to be an expert on electromagnetism. He should have advisors who can tell him about electromagnetism, for sure. He may not be the PhD in economics, but he should have advisors who know what economics teaches. But when it comes to the Constitution that he took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend, for God's sakes, man, take a basic UX civics class before you run for president. That's the expertise I find most disturbingly lacking in our current commander-in-chief.
Maybe then he'll understand that he can't just do whatever he wants.
Right, which he basically says in a variety of ways, which is curious. And he will certainly push the envelope. Okay, well, they say I can't run for a third term. Well, let's explore that.
Yeah. He doesn't, what the article also points out is he doesn't understand that we simply cannot make in the US all the minerals and elements and everything that we need. We have to import them. And it's so silly. They talk about that this is the only, how do they think that it's going to be effective to say, okay, you're ripping us off on magnets, we're going to tax our people even more? Like, it's just so, it's dumb.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's combining multiple ignorances, scientific ignorance about what it takes to make magnets and the importance of magnets in our technological society, but also economics. So taxing Americans is going to fix the problem, is it? No, obviously, when you look at it that way. But of course, that's one of the reasons why he conceptually just cannot let that escape his mouth. I'm collecting so much tariff revenue from China, not a dime from China. You're collecting only money from Americans, and only insofar as they buy Chinese stuff. And so rather than say, honestly, I'm taxing Americans to protect us from the Chinese controlling some rare earth mineral that is best to use in modern batteries. Boy, the guy is completely disconnected from reality on a number of fronts there, isn't he?
Yes. And speaking of being disconnected, I just want me to say that although I am the vice chairperson of the American Capitalist Party, and Mark, who is getting his makeup done, is the chairperson of the American Capitalist Party, this show has no affiliation with the American Capitalist Party, and the views expressed here are our own, even though Jim just froze, but he's unfrozen now.
Okay.
Jim, in the midst of all this, with what's going on with the president, the Republican Party that all just want to kiss his ass, the Democrats seem especially feckless.
Feckless. I mean, they are.
First, give me props for the word. I need to get some appreciation for coming out with.
You used the word feckless. Congratulations.
Okay, all right.
My goodness, you. But it's true. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, I'd use big words like usurpation or feckless, and people say, "What are you talking about, Jim?"
What do you mean, big words? Feckless is not a big word. It's a good word.
But there are a lot of people who don't know what it means. They don't know that it means some kind of, recklessness.
Okay, for my friends in Britain, if you don't know, if a person didn't know what feckless meant, would you consider them a numpty or a tosser? I'm just inquiring. Okay, Jim, get to the feckless Democrats who are full of codswallop.
Well, that would take the elucidation of terminology to me.
Okay. Kat Sterling wants to know if you're familiar with the term fuckbag. She wants to know. I don't know.
I have heard the term, I think, before, but
I don't think it's an actual term. I think it's something they just made up. It has no reference in reality. It's not a real concept.
Well, a lot of these exclamations, let's put it that way, you have to really to trace the etymological origins of. It's really interesting, but I'd be careful, Michael. 10 years from now, it might be in the Oxford English Dictionary.
It could be. For everybody in the audience who uses the term fuckbag, I would like to know what the conceptual common denominator is from fuckbag and that from which you're differentiating it.
Well, nothing more than right? Is what they're saying. He's barely a biological reality.
Okay, back to the feckless Democrats.
Yes.
No, you're supposed to tell me about them.
The Democrats are being very foolish, and in my view, but of course they're right now in emotional breakdown. I can't explain the stupidity of the Democrats on this. They're extremely ineffective in general right now. They're being extremely ineffective. No matter, Trump, his popularity on him, he came in because of immigration. His popularity has declined on that. Trump comes in because of, X issue, inflation. His popularity has declined on that as people don't see, affordability going down in many places. But compared to even with that declining, compared to the Democrats are sucking gas right now, politically speaking. And it's the direct result of their irrationality. They're emotional. They are moralists. They are religious in their thinking. And this religious, we were just talking about it in their terms of their hatred of economics. They talk about, follow the science. When it comes to things like the science of politics or the science of economics, they seem to be getting an F grade. Because they really are not addressing, they could be jumping on all kinds of things that Trump is doing, and they're not being effective about it. Instead, they're worrying about redistricting, which is only going to turn off independence, and they're on the losing side of that battle. I mean, whatever you think of redistricting, it's not going to grab the imagination of the American people. So the Democrats are wandering in the wilderness, rudderless in a way I haven't, every time they lose the White House, the party out of power is leaderless every time. But in this particular case, I've never seen a party in the wilderness, if you will, wandering about so irrationally, not responding politically, economically, with any kind of sense. But that would require them, to often take positions like we take here. If they really wanted to be rational, they really wanted to seize the moral high ground and the practical high ground from Donald Trump, they would focus on issues the way advocates of capitalism would. But they're constitutionally, it seems to me, unable. And moreover, what little support they have, and it's declining, comes from these far left kooks. So.
Well, like you said, it's like a religious sort
Yeah,
of mentality. It's a religious thinking. You know, while I would disagree with the Democrats that were, basically pro-labor, a little welfare state, but not going overboard. I disagree with them, but they seem to have a message that was directed toward the middle class. But they seem to just gone to every fringe that they can possibly go to. It's about race. It's about sex. Rush Limbaugh used to say that they believed that when they were hippies in the 60s, that was wisdom. And they now apply it. Now, I don't know how true, how right Rush is, but I think that there's definitely a good analogy to be made to that, because they're just so, first of all, they're self-righteous, a lot of them in their proclamations. And while I'm not for just catering to people, I think that you should, adhere to principle. Those principles have to be tied to reality. So they've got these principles that they just derive from their emotions, and then they're ridiculous, and they want to impose them on everybody else. And it's just not a winning message. But now that, even for those who have learned that, they don't seem to know how to fight against Donald Trump at all.
well, and you look at the practical. I mean, during my lifetime, again, politics. George McGovern lost in a landslide to Richard Nixon, even during Vietnam, and so people like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, they were willing to triangulate in certain ways. Jimmy Carter would deregulate our economy if necessary and put in a fierce monetarist over at the Fed and so forth. I mean, there's certain things that Jimmy Carter did which were not traditional Democrat. And when Clinton lost his first midterm, boy, did he triangulate and shift around. And the era of big government's over, and he's going to cut a deal with Newt Gingrich on welfare reform and balance the budget and so forth. He'll have Alan Greenspan up there in the gallery with Hillary Clinton as he's declaring the era of big government over. And Obama. Now, even policies we associate with Trump that we might not like, Obama deported more than 3 million people. Obama came into office. He opposed, here, something I really disagree with. He opposed gay marriage, believe it or not. The
Yeah.
reason why Democrats get elected. Now, why did they, in the Democratic primary, they put Biden in back in 2020? Well, he wasn't Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. So all of that logic about our going to our moderation, our more, let me put it this way, our greater realism is the way they might put it, is what gets them elected and has been their success. And if you go nutso, with transgender stuff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or if you look like you're opposed to, we can talk about Trump overdoing it and the declining crime rate, but if you look like you're defending criminals, then of course you're going to turn off the majority of the American people. They have no sense of that now. They're in one of these. This is why I think they're lost in the wilderness in a way they've never been before. Because rather than, quote, checking their premises about having gone too far, what the McGovern say, or Kamala Harris. I mean, Trump wasn't particularly beloved figure. He had high negatives, and yet he fair and square beat Kamala Harris in the last election. Why? Because Kamala Harris was saying a whole lot of ridiculous things. She couldn't put together a credible policy response to
She couldn't put together
a coherent sentence.
Either,
Exactly.
right?
So, but rather than, quote, as we say, as Ayn Rand used to say, check your premises, rather than checking the premises of what caused them failure and what historically in recent decades have caused them success, they're just doubling down on the worst parts of it and the parts of it that really turn off the American people. American people may be getting souring on Trump's immigration policy, but if you come out and say, well, no, we won't deport criminal aliens at all, then you've turned off the American people in a dramatic way. And they, for the life of them, they can't find their rear end with both hands on this subject. And they need to start getting their act together before the midterms, and I don't see it happening. They should historically take back the House, if history is any indication. But they're having a hard time putting together a policy platform, just a policy platform that might actually appeal to people. And that bodes very poorly, especially for the next presidential election. The Democrats better get their act together in a different way, because they are, if Trump is declining in popularity, the Democrats are doing still worse.
Yeah.
Saw those statistics. The Democrats have lost in recent years 2 million registrants. The Republicans have gained 2.4 million registrants. With fundraising, it's a disaster. With, you can go right across the board. The Democrat brand is sucking, even as Trump's own popularity in certain issues is declining. So that's not a good situation, Democrats, and I'd check your premises.
I didn't even hear you say this, Jim, but somebody, maybe he's not talking to you. Did you say that a Democrat said that nobody should be deported?
Democrats have, in effect, taken the position that you can't deport even criminal aliens. And that's the practical impact of some of these mayors saying we won't cooperate with ICE.
Oh, okay. So you're not saying that they actually literally made the claim. You're just saying that that's the effect of
that's what it looks. The perception for the American
people, okay, I got it.
Protecting criminal aliens. I mean, why would cities not cooperate with ICE on anybody, even when it comes to jails? People who are in jail, people charged or convicted of crimes. Now, when Democrats are saying, well, you can't come in, ICE can't come into jails, we're not going to respect ICE detainers. Wow, it sure sounds like, in effect, you're defending criminal aliens.
So now I forgot what the hell I was going to say. Oh, the growth agenda. There's this growth agenda out there from Ezra Klein and someone else. They wrote a book. I'm wondering, do you think that the Dems have a shot if they embrace this, and is there any sign even that they would embrace it?
Yeah, the first thing is even the idea of growth. See, they don't think that way. They don't think in terms of a dynamic. This is one thing where at least nominally the Republicans are still just a little better than the Republicans. We want dynamic scoring of our tax cuts. We want, because growth is what matters. You can't hold, it's not a fixed zero sum. No. That is against their very psychoepistemology is zero sum. So in their mind, I don't see, and this is the problem, they're in the thrall of these academics who refuse to see things in that way. They're in the thrall of left-wing activists who refuse to see things that way. It's how we cut up the pie that matters, not the size of the pie, which, of course, is their standard BS thinking. So, no, I don't see either Democrat activists sure ain't going to embrace it. But it itself is contradictory. I mean, if you were going to come on. If you really believe economics is a science, you're going to embrace true free market policies, or at least far more substantially free market policies, even than that. But growth? What do you mean growth? You mean people getting rich? That's going to rape the environment. That's going to cause there to be rich people, and there ought not to even be billionaires. So if you walk in with a religious moral premise that says there ought not to be billionaires, or economic progress means the rape of the planet Earth, well, then, of course, you talk growth economics to these people, and they're going to call you a fascist. They're going to call you, Adolf Hitler. When, of course, free market economics is exactly the opposite of fascism.
Yeah, that whole thing is ridiculous. The idea that capitalists are fascists. So before we did
my homework.
Yes, you did. Now, before I get, now the thing is, in most schools, when the kid does his homework, it's no big deal. But granted, in this school, when Mark Pellegrino doesn't do his homework hardly ever, when the guy comes on and does his homework, we should give him applause. He's definitely not feckless. So no, definitely not. So the last thing, Jim, I want to ask you about before you give your capitalist thought of the day, this story where they fired the head of the CDC, evidently because she's differing with RFK. This seems to me a very dangerous road that we're on with Trump, where the firing of everyone who contradicts him. And I shouldn't say everyone, but there's been quite a few. That it doesn't seem to me it bodes well, apart from whether RFK Jr. is a nut, which he seems like he is. I haven't
on vaccines.
He seems nutty. Yeah.
Yeah, he's said some ridiculous things.
Yeah.
Vaccines. Yes. Now, but the point though is that Oh God, when we created the administrative state, again within the last century here, starting in the 1930s and getting very aggressive in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they created something unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court itself has been pushing back. I mean, and remember, this is we were very critical of Trump here, but I like to point out the pre-Trump precedents for Trump. Obama, within his rights, when he came into office, fired every single U.S. attorney in every single district of America. That was his right. And under existing law, the president could do that. Their policy-making positions. Since then, the Supreme Court in 2020, this Consumer, Financial Protection Agency was held to be, in effect, unconstitutional insofar as it would prevent a president from firing the person. Now, there was a for-cause fire element to that, but in the 2020 Supreme Court case of Seiler LLC, right? You can all look it up. It's 2020 Seiler. Seiler. What did they say? They said, nope, the president has the power to fire those people, even if there's a for-cause requirement before firing them in the law. You cannot have an unaccountable bureaucracy. The power to appoint means the power to remove, and that's in the Constitution. Now, the Supreme Court, in my mind, that's a good move in one sense. You can't have an unaccountable bureaucracy. Congress even can't create this fourth branch of government that unconstitutionally fuses what should be separated powers. But the Supreme Court is increased, and the more they fight Trump on these things, the question is, could he fire the Fed chairman? I think because of that 2020 case and other Supreme Court cases recently, I think we have an open constitutional question. Could the president fire the Fed chairman? Now, when it comes to the CDC director, that's almost it echoes the Seiler case. I think the president has the right to remove the head of the CDC.
But Jim, that's the legal case. What I'm talking about is in terms of the dangerousness of having someone who only wants people around him that agree with him.
Well, but welcome to Washington D.C. All politicians are putting in. It's even on the state level. California with the redistricting thing. Well, we created in 2010 this independent commission. Well, who's on that independent commission? A whole bunch of Democrats who are doing a whole bunch of gerrymandering in a very partisan way. So you can call it an independent commission all you like, state of California. The governors that have been in there since 2010.
Jim, this is where it's codswallop. I'm calling codswallop on Jim Valliant here because Obama had in his cabinet. No, what I'm saying is that I'm talking specifically about the desire to have sycophants surround you. And Obama appointed the person that ran against him to the Secretary of State. He kept on Robert Gates as his Secretary of Defense. Clinton had William Cohen, who was a Republican. They kept Greenspan on. It's just
perception. It's perception versus reality. When it isn't in the news, believe me, since the dawn of time, they've been stacking agencies with partisan friends of theirs.
Of course they do that. But Jim,
get away with it, removing people for part of. But you're right.
But this is codswallop.
Look, George Washington set an amazing precedent. He put both Hamilton, the ultra-federalist, and Jefferson, the ultra in his cabinet. And there has been a tradition that has continued from that. Some presidents have followed it more. Some presidents have followed it less. But the idea that, oh, no, I can reach out and I can appoint someone different. But you know what Trump would say? Trump would say, look at all the Democrats that I put. Now, they were yes men Democrats. Look, I put Tulsi Gabbard in there. I put RFK in there. These guys were Democrats.
But they're not Democrats anymore.
They're not Democrats anymore.
And they're also sycophants.
And they are ass kissers. But the point is, but also on one hand, when you're the president of the United States, there's nothing wrong with putting in people who agree with your policies and who are loyal to you. To some degree, that's perfectly appropriate. You don't want people undermining your policy.
You don't, Jim, but he doesn't tolerate. Everybody has to be loyal to him. You have to call a spade here.
Now, this is another point. When he didn't like the election results in 2020, he was harsh on Vice President Pence, who refused to do what he wanted in the Senate. He was harsh on Barr, his attorney general, who was saying, no, I'm sorry, and he gave the pushback. Thank God for Pence and Barr. They really may have helped prevent a much worse constitutional crisis.
And they won't be there this time.
They won't be. And that was the lesson Trump took away. Now I want people who will do my bidding at the snap of my finger, even if I ask them to, do something completely absurd.
Yes.
And that is dangerous. They should have independent people. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was a classic example.
Team of rivals.
Rivals. People who opposed him. He had a wide variety of people on his cabinet, so he could get a variety of opinions. And that was considered a president with good judgment. A president with good judgment. And that's the way we normally looked at presidential appointments. But that's been breaking down all over the place. And it may be less obvious, but come on. The people who surrounded Biden, these guys were covering up for the man's senility. You had a DHS secretary when millions were pouring over the border. Now, I'm in favor of liberal immigration, as you know. But when millions of people were pouring over the border, he said, what? The border's closed. Or his economic advisor saying, oh, well, it's a transitory, inflation is a transitory.
This is all true. They did cover up for I was going to say, Biden. But and Ian Gilmore is going to make the last point of the day. Ian, this is a great point. I love Jim. Jim is wrong on a lot of things. And by the way, I love Mark Pellegrino. I'm teasing him. I'm not serious. He's a wonderful guy, as is Jim. If we go out to dinner, the three of us together, I'll be like Mo and clunk their heads together. So Ian Gilmore says Ian Gilmore said the problem is that Congress is not doing its job. And yes, I agree. I agree with. Now, Jim, give your capitalist thought of the day, because when it comes to capitalism, I know you're right. I trust you on this.
Well, capitalism does mean that we have to have limited authority for each element of the government. And when Congress doesn't do its job, there's a wonderful transition to a capitalist thought of the day. When Congress fails to do its job, it invites an aggressive executive. And the more the executive's actions go unchecked, the less capitalist we are. Capitalism opposes strong government. A lot of conservatives think capitalism means we have strong leadership and we have a tough, government, and we're muscular overseas and stuff. Donald Trump isn't, particularly. I mean, you can compare him to Democrats, particularly muscular overseas, but he is a guy who wants to run everything and thinks he can do anything. And the whole genius of the American system of government is that it's separated powers and responsibilities between judges, the legislature, and the president. And when the Congress, and he's absolutely correct, when Congress fails to do its job, what it does is it creates an imperial presidency. And nothing could be less capitalistic. Capitalism is about empowering the individual, increasing freedom, and a strong executive is heading down the path towards creating a Caesar, the very thing that our founding fathers did not want to reproduce in history, the Roman Republic's decay into an empire. But that is exactly what we've been watching. It is not unique to Trump. We've been heading in this direction for decades, as I've pointed out, this increasingly powerful executive. But Congress's failure to act, the breakdown of the American system of separation of powers, does not bode well. We're heading in a fascist direction, i.e., a dictatorial direction. And when the parties change and it's some Democrat who then imitates what Trump is doing, just as Trump is outdoing and imitating the people that came before him, we are heading down a dark path towards dictatorship, which is the opposite of capitalism.
Awesome. Now we've given the audience an extra 3 minutes and 45 seconds. You are welcome, audience. So now remember, you better like it. You better share it from YouTube to your social media platforms. For God's sake, subscribe if you haven't done so already. And Jim, where can they find you?
Oh, well, they can find me at Facebook, where I answer questions almost every day. James Valliant. Hit me up if you got any questions. I do podcasts for the Ayn Rand Center UK. Well, geez, is a podcast called The Rational Egoist I sometimes appear on. And, well, you'll sometimes find me even here, believe it or not.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks a lot, Jim. Thank you, audience. We will see you tomorrow.